Okay, good morning. I expect more people will show up as we talk, but how many of you folks were not here at having to my soil talk before? Okay, so we'll do that, a quick review of that, and maybe other people show up in time.
Yeah, 22 is closed, so everybody's getting off.
Oh.
So it's backed up. The 17 exit's backed up forever.
Uh-huh. Okay, so the main topic we talk about all the time, and 2 weeks ago the class was on soil. Um, Unfortunately, the industry is not telling you what good dirt is. The perfect soil would be sandy loam. If you've got sandy loam in your yard, which most houses in Santa Ana, Anaheim, Garden Grove, the flatter areas of Tustin and Irvine between the 5 and the foothills, this is the soil. It's mostly sand, a little bit of silt, a little tiny bit of clay. It's the best soil you can ever garden in. The problem in the industry is that they're telling you to put in compost. And they're selling compost as dirt, and all compost is a ground up dead tree. Sometimes mixed with other types of manures, but it's pretty much what they're selling you is 100% organic, which really is a euphemism to say that's 100% dead bodies of something. And essentially it's dead bodies of plants that you're trying to grow plants in. Well, the problem is this is the perfect home for a mushroom or mold or bacteria. It's not the plant's home. This is the plant's home. The plant's home is essentially 100% mineral. Now, up until a few years ago, they said, oh, it's 99.1% mineral, 0.9% organic. Well, when University of New Hampshire did a further study, a more careful study on the soil, they said, no, that 0.9% organic matter that the other people were finding is the living organisms in the ground that were getting mixed into the survey. So people are cutting off pieces of root or fungus or living bacteria and counting it as dead organic matter. So they got 0.9% organic, but the University of New Hampshire says soil that plants grow in, 100% mineral. So mineral being primarily quartz. So if lightning hits the ground, you get glass because the ground is primarily quartz. This is how you make dirt. You just take a rock like a piece of granite and grind it up. That's what this is. It's not anything that has to do with anything that's been alive before. So quartz, if this was granite, I'm not positive this is pure granite, but you know what granite looks like. The white specks in there are pure quartz crystals, which becomes the sand and the silt. And then the darker specks, called feldspar, become the clay. And that's quartz combined with aluminum or iron, makes it either grayish or reddish. I think magnesium's in there too. Certain minerals make it turn darker, and they make the crystals. So sand and silt are primarily round particles. Clay are primarily flat particles. So if you look at it blown up now, this is not perfect. If the tennis balls are supposed to be the sand, they should be the size of bowling balls. And the silt, which is just pieces of the sand that chipped off, are these table tennis balls. And then the lentil seeds are supposed to be the clay, but they should be flat, more like confetti. And then that would be how soil works. So what plants need from soil, what they want from soil, let's take a typical plant. The roots want to have moisture around them at all times. And how soil stores moisture is the surface of each particle has got a negative charge. Water being ionic, positive, negative, the water sticks to these particles, one molecule thick, quite, well, very strongly attracted. The clay having the most surface area because it's smaller particles holds water better than the larger round particles. But then the next most important thing that soil has to do is provide oxygen to the roots. So On a plant, of course, they take carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, water, make oxygen and sugar. That's what they're programmed to do. That's what photosynthesis is all about. The roots need to breathe oxygen too. The plants make oxygen, but they don't have a transport system from the leaves where the oxygen is made to the roots. The oxygen goes out into the atmosphere, and the air's got to go through the dirt to the roots to help the roots breathe. Now, roots on plants don't need as much air as we do. I mean, if you were buried in the ground, you'd suffocate right away. Plant roots get by with a lot less oxygen. They can hold their breath for about 2 days. So if the soil is coarse, so if you have a lot of sand out there, we call that the ability to hold water is the porosity of the soil. The more porous it is, the more water it can hold. That means there's more little gaps in the soil that water can collect on. The bigger air spaces in the soil contribute to its permeability. That's the ability for air to go through the soil and help it breathe. And the bigger particles are best for that. It turns out that there's more air spaces between smaller particles, but they're so small that there's too much friction. The air can't get through. The bigger particles, now if you've taken geometry or physics, a round ball, a round sphere, if you have a container full of it, and these are solid rock, the solid rock would make up 2/3 of the volume, and the air spaces between them 1/3. So there's a lot of air spaces in sand. If you have a totally sandy soil, which this is close to, that soil is 1/3 air spaces, and there it breathes really well. Now clay does have more air spaces than sand, but they're so tiny the air can't get through. In fact, usually the spaces between the clay are clogged up with water. Now, there's not a problem in that initially because water in general out of our taps and rainwater definitely have a lot of oxygen, so fish can breathe in there, and plant roots can breathe in there too. What we know about plants is that they would like ideally 6 to 8 parts per million of oxygen, O2, in water. That's ideal. When it drops down to about 2 parts per million oxygen, that's when the roots start to suffocate. So water will suffocate a plant if the oxygen level drops too low. Now, there's an issue because people are being told that they water too much. Well, in theory, our tap water has got oxygen in it. You should never be able to overwater a plant unless the water just sits there and sits there and sits there for weeks and weeks, and the roots eventually use up all the oxygen and then they suffocate. But if there's drain holes in the bottom and the water's free to come through, there should not be anything called overwatering of a plant. It shouldn't kill it because our tap water's got enough oxygen. The problem we have is that most plants are being grown in compost or ground up wood, which takes away the oxygen. It's still, I've argued with compost people. They keep telling me this stuff they're selling is finished compost. Well, no. If it was finished compost, it'd be carbon dioxide and water. That's what compost eventually ends up is carbon dioxide and water. This is still decomposing, and at a fairly high rate. So you put this in water. If you put compost, any kind of compost I can think of in a bucket of water, within 1 week it smells like a sewer in there. It's using up the water so fast, oxygen so fast in that water, it can't, even though it's say a bucket of water, it can't be, we call it, oxygenated fast enough to make up for it, and the thing starts making sewer gases that stink. That's what happens when there's not enough oxygen to decompose things, is you get sewer gases. So you put this in a bucket of water and start stinking in a week. Because of that, that means there's no oxygen in that water left. And that's what's killing the plants. The fact that they're growing in dead stuff and you water it, and the oxygen in the water is getting used up by this rather than the plant's roots. So the plant starts turning yellow, and they'll tell you you're overwatering it. Well, it's not your fault. We used to be able to water plants as often as we wanted, and it never hurted them until the 80s when we started using compost as a soil substitute. Now, some plants, it is true, some plants need less oxygen than others in the root system. So we don't mind growing lilies in the stuff that the growers grow for us, but you can see this one's not real happy. It won't die, though. This is a daylily. They don't die from lack of oxygen around their roots. But this grower used to be our best grower. This used to be our best supplier of plants, but they changed their soil recently. Now, truthfully, they've always had a lot of organic matter soil, but they used to use what is called redwood compost, which was redwood sawdust. And redwood happens to be the slowest decomposing wood known. So you can put redwood in water and it doesn't really cause, that is the compost, the sawdust in water, and it doesn't really cause much trouble because it's so slow to decompose. But they switched it. They had the old grower retired. They got the new guys that learned at college to grow things in compost. The problem with the redwood sawdust that they were using was that it didn't hold that much water, so their plants would tend to dry out fast, but you can water as much as you want, never hurt them, and they would be fine in the pot for years. They switched to this finely ground organic matter that rots them very quickly within 6 months, although, again, daylilies are safe in that, but we have to watch what we buy from them now, and if we buy something that rots easily, we'll have to take it out of there and change the dirt to our own soil within a few months to make sure the plant survives. Now, I've talked to this grower in length, a new guy, and he actually talked to his soil supplier to see what they could, if they could try something different. But the soil supplier they're using told them that sand and other minerals like volcanic rock, sponge rock that are fine are really wearing on their machinery. So they'd rather not. They don't want to use any mineral if they can help it because it chews up their blending machines. That's their excuse. So they'd rather use wood products because it's softer on their machinery. That's the lamest excuse I've ever heard, but it's an excuse that you can use the wrong things. But the sales rep that used to sell these plants to me, from this company, he quit because he couldn't stand selling plants that were dying on the displays. And because he knew me so long, he knew what was going on, but he couldn't convince the new owners of the new leaders of this nursery that they were doing anything wrong, because in the 3 months it takes them to grow a plant in a pot and get it out of the store, they look pretty darn good. Organic matter does have some advantages in the short haul. They can make it chippy so it breathes well. Certainly it's got a lot of nutritional value, but it's not a permanent thing, and it's still consuming oxygen. So once the stuff starts decomposing, the permeability goes downhill, porosity goes sky high, so it stays like a black, slimy, sludgy thing. And most plants start dying in that. They can't breathe in it. Even though it's got plenty of nutrition, they just can't breathe. You lose your root system. So, another plant that can handle it quite well happens to be roses. So even though this has got a lot of ground up wood in there, roses are pretty. Now what we find with roses is they don't like it, but they can reconfigure their root system so quickly to the surface where they breathe better that they happen to be able to survive it. So we found that out back in the 80s. My first house I lived at, I had a planter bed, and I thought I was going to do a good thing, so I made it 1/3 organic material in there, put the rose in there. They look great. No roots below 6 inches. The roots below 6 inches were black and slimed out. Everything, all the healthy roots were near the surface where they can breathe. The roses look fine. They just didn't need the bottom roots. They could survive on the top ones. So some plants can adapt quite well. This one doesn't adapt at all. This is Gardenia. So that's one plant that we grow ourselves from cuttings, because the stuff that from the growers doesn't do well in a compost or wood-based mix, and they don't survive the purging, because there's a lot of plants you can shake off the root system, redo it in better dirt, and it makes it. Gardenias, we have less than 50% take, whereas most plants it's closer to 100%, no problems. So gardenias we grow ourselves. And generally what we find when you have healthy roots, the leaves are bigger. So if you look at gardenias that other growers grow, their leaves aren't as big as ours.
Is that true of all plants?
It seems to be. And the color is definitely better. So we notice that when we take the soil off of plants that are in the wrong dirt, it's like when you just first start working on them, you go, boy, the leaves in this plant suddenly look green. It's like when they're in that compost stuff, the roots are holding their breath. I mean, the first time I encountered this, when I learned about this stuff, it was from a NASA researcher. He was finding potting soil for the space shuttle, and he was going around the nursery telling everybody that your soil is terrible. What's wrong with you guys? And no one believed him, but he came to me in the early 90s, and I was so frustrated with our potting soils back then that I listened to him, and so he kind of mentored me for a few years and showed me what was up. So we took a plant, it was a papaya that was in a 1-gallon pot full of, at that time we're using, quote, super soil. And papayas were the most sensitive plants to watering. You watered them 2 days in a row, they would rot and fall out of the pot. You would have to wait till that soil is bone dry before you can water it. So he said, bring your worst plant. I brought up papaya. He gave me an ice pick and said, start taking the dirt off and watch your plant. See what happens. He wasn't going to tell me anything. But what I had noticed is that my papaya plant started picking off the soil off the roots. And within a half hour, I noticed that the leaves went from here like this. I told him the plant looks a lot happier now that I'm taking the soil off. And he says, yeah. That's what he noticed too when he started doing that. So we started fooling around with soil mix at that time. He told me that, you know, any organic matter in the soil, anything, you know, you shouldn't even call it organic, you should call it any dead stuff around the roots, kills the roots. They don't like that dead stuff around them. What they ended up sending the space shuttle was spun glass, which is quartz, you know, material that's similar to something like this, a woven mineral. He was working with pumice, but he says pumice floats around the spacecraft too much in outer space, so they had to use something that was woven together. But it's the same material as sand, salt, and clay, essentially. So we started making our own potting soils back in the early 90s. We noticed that pumice rock, which worked really well, the lightest form of quartz you can get by nature, just doesn't hold water well enough. So I asked the guys over at UC Riverside what holds water the best. They said for plant growing, they told me peat moss does. So we decided to put two opposites together, the one that has the most airflow and the one that has the most water retention, and put them together. And that's how we got our acid mix. And to this day, we still use it because it works really well. Pumice, you'd have to water twice a day, but our acid mix, you don't, just normal watering on that. The problem with peat moss is it's not quite permanent enough, even though peat doesn't seem to cause trouble with plant root health that much. Because it's not permanent material, it breaks down over a 5-year period and the soil shrinks a bit. And if you had pure peat, which you can use for about a year at a time, the plant roots start suffocating after a year and a half or so, because the permeability drops as this stuff turns back into black muck, back into a peat bog. So it's not perfect. The pumice rock we mixed with it, though, keeps it breathing. according to the pumice researchers, they said if you can have pure clay, but if you mix 20% pumice into it, that's pretty much rock-to-rock contact within that clay, and it'll still breathe. Well, this is 50% volcanic rock, 50% peat. It can breathe forever. We haven't had any problem with longevity on this, except the fact that it shrinks a bit. So we came up with one with less peat in it, our top pot, 1/3 peat, and it doesn't seem to shrink at all. So we think what's going on, because the peat moss is still decomposing in there, what we think is that once you're down to about 1/3 peat moss, the strands of peat moss kind of sit between the big pieces of rock, and they no longer contribute to volume, kind of like this sample here. Now, again, when you have sand and silt as a soil, it's 1/3 air spaces, real well breathing. The clay clogs up the air spaces. And it turns out that any soil that's more than 1/3 clay, you'll fill up all the gaps between the round particles. And at that point, your soil becomes clay. So you only need about 35% clay in your soil mix, in your soil, to call it a clay soil. Because at that point, even though we have a lot of sand in there, the hills behind us are called, well, not the volcanic hill, Panorama Hill, but the other hills, Tustin Hills, sandy clay. So there's plenty of sand in there. It's real gritty, but enough clay to clog up all the air spaces. Still drains pretty well because it's on a hillside, but it does have clay in it. Now, clay is not poisonous, except when you put a plant that's grown in compost in it, then it rots away. Because the clay doesn't exchange air that well, and then that compost that comes with the plants is like in a little bucket of, and it's just rotting in there, not breathing well, and it dies. If you took a plant that we grew and stuck it in clay, should not be any issues. Because there's nothing in here that's decomposing very quickly, so it's not going to, plant's not going to suffocate in the clay with this in it. One way to do a quick soil test, so you can see what your soil has. Get a mayonnaise jar, fill dirt, 1/2, 2/3, water to the neck, a few drops of soap in there, shake up your soil real good, get all the clods dissolved away or broken down in little bits, and then set it down. And what happens in a jar of water is the sand, being the biggest particles, are the heaviest. Well, they're the heaviest in comparison to the water, so they drop first. Silt on top. You can't tell the difference between silt and sand visually, but the clay settles overnight. Clay is like grease in the water. If you swirl it up a little bit, you can see it kind of coming off the surface. Clay is a real fine particle. You can't see it. Looks like grease in there, and it settles on top overnight. And in this sample from this soil on a farm in Irvine, it's maybe 1/8 of an inch thick. It's really thin layer of clay in their soil. The farmer told me this soil is the best he's ever farmed on, or as good a soil as he's farmed on. The soil in the riverbeds is the same. The guys, it's funny what they tell you. The farmers, we've talked to some strawberry farmers who farm along the Santa Ana River in Anaheim. They said, boy, this soil's so rich, the strawberries grow like crazy. Well, strawberries don't want rich soil. They want breathing soil. They want soil that breathes. They love sand.
What is the percentage of sand to silt?
Well, it's hard to say. I would say sand on this one's 75% perhaps, silt maybe about 10, clay maybe 5. It's mostly sand.
If the silt was a higher percentage, that would be good?
Yeah. And you know, the funny thing about soil terminology is the journalists, people who write books and the articles, really have screwed it up, because the original, so let's say sand, silt, and clay. So in this sandy loam soil, you can say it's roughly 40. Well, on this one it's actually more like 60, let's make it 70, 20, 10, something like that. That would be more or less a sandy loam. Now, loam just means that you got significant portions of all three particle sizes in there. If you just had pure sand, your soil's going to dry out fairly fast. You need some silt and some clay to hold more moisture. Rich loam, which is what the farmers used to want. So you go back into the 1800s before they had irrigation, the farmers didn't want this soil. They couldn't farm there because it'd be dry in 2 weeks. And they didn't have any irrigation. So this was the poor soil. The rich soil was the clay stuff. Let's say about 30, 30, 40, something like that. You know, lots of clay in there. Not too much clay to be too, you know, when they used to farm Orange County, they used to farm closer to the ocean. You know, back in the 30s and 40s when the bean fields there in Fountain Valley, that's all clay. But to the farmers, that was rich soil because it held the water. Now they'd rather farm over here in the sandy soil because things grow faster in here as long as you water it, and they don't rot. So the whole thing about rich and poor soil has switched. So sandy loam used to be called poor soil. Certain plants grow in poor soil better because they breathe better. Tarragon, they always say they don't like rich soil, they like poor soil. Well, unfortunately, the journalists have switched rich soil to mean lots of compost. Same consequence, no oxygen. So with tarragon and some other of those things that rot really easy, you want poor soil, which is more sandy.
If we had like 20% clay and 50% silt, would that be okay?
Probably. Yeah, that'd probably be, yeah. I mean, the geologists who know the area, you know, you can give them a bucket of soil and they'll tell you exactly where it's from. You know, every area of Orange County's got a slightly different ratios of these things and slightly different colors too. So they'll tell you what formation in the hills it's from, where you got it from. So they know the soil real well.
So Gary, so if it doesn't really matter which of those that you have. It's just that just determines how frequent you water it.
True. If you have more clay soil, you don't have to. Well,
I mean, as long as it's not 60% clay or
Right.
80, you know, where it's totally drowning, right?
Right.
I mean, but if your clay amount is not that high, then
Yeah, generally, well, some areas near the ocean get pretty high in clay. So those areas, the plants that are growing in compost have a lot of problems.
that's the issue, though, is the compost, right?
Right.
Like if it's in sandy loam or rich loam, it's just as how often you water it, as long as you keep that compost out of it where it's
Right.
not.
Right, because clay soil is not poison at all. Back in the 80s, back in the 60s, when I moved to Orange County, yeah, there's no issues. My dad lived in Mission Vale. We had clay soil. We didn't lose any plants because in those days the growers didn't grow things in compost. And now that they do, everybody's losing plants, and the blame is put on water, not what it should be, is the compost in the soil. Because in those days when we put organic matter in the ground, we did not put much. I remember we told everybody, oh, you put 1 bag of nitrohumus and 1 bag of rodent compost, which really isn't bad anyway, per 100 square feet in your yard, and you till it in, and you've got good soil. Well, you spread a bag of redwood compost and a bag of nitrohumus over 100 square feet, it's like that thick. And you till it in, it's like, well, that's maybe 5% of soil volume, perhaps. And that's all we did. We just tilled that in, till people put their plants in there, and everybody was fine. In the 60s, 70s, early 80s, and the late 80s, everything started rotting. The ag department came and told my dad, you can't water your plants every day. But from the 50s to the 80s, he had watered everything every day without a problem. And suddenly in the 80s, when the growers started they were, it's not the growers' fault. They're just listening. They're hiring kids graduating from the colleges. They're being told,
The experts.
yeah, that compost is better than dirt for growing things in pots. Or, they weren't saying compost. They're saying organic matter. You need the organic matter for nutritional purposes. Shame on you if you don't use it. And that's what all the growers were being told. That you can't grow things in sand. I mean, it's really strange. I talk to the younger growers, and I tell them, this stuff will grow fine in pure sand. They said, you can't grow plants in real sand. That's how shocked they are. That's how the colleges make their minds think. Now, I would tell you, OCC, Cal State Fullerton, not a problem. But whoever's teaching the nurserymen to do this stuff, I don't know. It's like they're from another planet, from where I came from. Because when I was a kid, I played in my dad's dirt pile. It was this. And then suddenly it became this in the 80s and 90s.
You were mixing on top of it and till it in a little bit was the...
Well, we mixed redwood compost and nitrohumus, which was human sludge, into the soil, but such a small amount. It's just almost negligible, really. That's also what Kellogg's would do to farms. They would mix human sludge into the farms. So I went out to a lunch meeting with Hap Kellogg III back in the 90s, because he had been puzzled because we stopped buying grow mulch and all their products and started selling our own stuff. But he fortunately brought his science person along to sell, and we talked about it. I said, well, how much organic matter did you turn into the farms? So we calculated out, on the farms when they tilled in the sewage stuff, it was essentially that thick. So the University of California went around the farms and determining how much organic matter is in the soil. And it turns out on a farm, on the average farm, because back in 1950 it was 0.9%, which is what it is in nature. And it was 1.1% in 2000. They said, perfect, farmers are doing a great job, 1.1% organic. But here, we're being told to make the soil half this and half mineral. And this is, to us, a lethal dose. When you go 50% organic, because the way I learned is back in the early 90s, I bought a house and didn't know all this stuff. Had all these raised planters to fill, brought in 17 truckloads of topsoil, which was sandy loam mixed with this, 60%, 40%, put in my beds, put all my plants and trees and shrubs in. A year later, about a third of the things were just dead and rotten. I'm going, okay, this didn't happen to me before. I'm a nurseryman, I'm supposed to know this stuff. How come these things are dying? And they told me this was their best soil. And to this day, all the soil companies that sell soil to homeowners still sell a topsoil that's got way too much organic matter, and they can't figure it out. I mean, they don't know. They don't grow plants. They sell dirt.
So your 17 yards that you put in there, right? How long before that organic matter decomposes and rots out before you can add to it and make it, and it was...
We threw it
the right
away.
ratio?
We threw it away. We just got rid of it.
Dug it out.
We figured it was 40% organic. We'd have to get that organic matter down below 5%. Well, the ground would be raised up this high to do that, so we just threw it away. It took me 10 years to pull out I was pulling out about half a yard a week. We had brought in 170 cubic yards. I was doing a half yard a week, throwing in our trash bin at the store, and changing it back to sandy loam. We noticed what happened after we did this. When we're digging out the topsoil, there was like one root running through it about every 6 inches. There were more roots right at the surface, and a lot of roots in our native clay soil below it. But there's hardly any roots in it. Every 6 inches, one root going through. When we switched it back to sandy loam and checked it after 3 months, one root every quarter inch is what it should be.
So what did you put back in, and
Sandy loam.
where do somebody get that?
Yeah, the easiest way, because all soil companies have sandy loam. It's part of their mix. they'll refuse to sell it to you. Now, sandy loam is often called fill dirt because it's on a construction site. It's what you would fill a hole with because it doesn't expand and shrink when it's wet and dry like clay does. So sandy loam is fill dirt, or some call it fill sand. It's not as clean as masonry sand that you can make concrete out of, or stuff like that. So they call it fill dirt, fill sand, sandy loam. They all have it, but they'll refuse to sell it to you if you tell them what you're going to use it for. If you tell them you're just going to fill a hole, they'll sell it to you. But it's really odd. They think they know what good soil is, and they keep trying to sell you. You know, we find so many homeowners that have ruined their yard because they use what is called topsoil in there. So never buy anything called topsoil because it's not real. It's been totally messed up with the organic content being way too high. So fill dirt, sandy loam. Most times we tell people go down to Larry's Building Supply. And if you mention our name, Laguna Hills Nursery, they won't try to force their topsoil on you. Because they still want to sell their topsoil. They make more money on it. But they know that our customers won't take it. And I don't know why they can't, some there can't do their own testing. Because we did our own testing back in the early 90s with all the different soil mixes. I mean, the first test we did was on strawberries. I mean, this is the one that opened my eyes. We had, at that time, the Whitney Farms potting soil was top of the line. So we had pots about, I think they were about 15-inch pots. Whitney Farms in one, pure sand in the other. The strawberry plant in the Whitney Farms grew about this big. Leaflets about that big. Stuff we were used to. In the pure sand, the plant was 2 foot wide. Leaflets that big. We're going, my God, that potting soil is poison. This plant is like 10 times bigger, the same exact plant, 10 times bigger in pure sand. We just couldn't believe it at all. So we started running through all the vegetable plants first with that and saw the same results in every one. Leaf color, leaves, huge, perfect foliage color. Everything about everything was perfect. No sign of any yellowing leaf ever. It was just crazy. Whereas in the potting soils, you get the brown tips, the yellow foliage, the red foliage, all the off-colored foliage. It's just because the roots were half rotten in there.
So what's the difference between the quartz sand and silica sand? Nothing?
No, it's the same thing.
Same thing.
Silicon dioxide is quartz.
Okay. So silica, if you had a bunch of bags of that, that's just the same.
Right. Now the problem with sand in a pot, I mean, we're putting sand in pots. The problem with sand in pots is you have a pot with a hole at the bottom, and you put pure sand in there, it's like an hourglass, just keeps running through. You'd have to put some paper or something on the bottom temporarily, or something lasts a short time to keep the sand from running through. That's why we use pumice rock. Pumice is like a plug, won't let anything else. So our top potting soil, which we grow most of our plants in, volcanic rock, sponge rock, sand, charcoal, and peat moss. Now, the reason we put charcoal in it, and charcoal is expensive. Most expensive material out there is charcoal because of the energy it takes to create it. But charcoal is what makes the rich black soils of the world rich and black. So charcoal is formed when you have trees, trunks exposed, wood exposed to really super hot temperatures, and there's not enough oxygen around to finish oxidizing the wood. It just turns to charcoal. Nature doesn't eat charcoal. You can still burn this, but nature doesn't do anything with charcoal. It's in inert form, so it lasts essentially forever. But it stores minerals really well. That's why you use charcoal as filters. The minerals get stuck on it, and it holds it right there. Organisms in the soil like living near it because of all the richness around it. And they said if you can go into the jungles in Central America and find a real green area, and you dig down there and you find an old campsite from 10,000 years ago, still storing a lot of nutrients right in that spot. Or near volcanoes, you get a lot of charcoal forming. Or if you have a really super hot wildfire, those things can really create a lot of charcoal in the forest, and that soil is black and rich forever. They said the charcoal content of rich black soil, 2%. Said it doesn't take much charcoal to make soil look black. If you ever worked with, was it toner in your office, which is pure carbon? Yeah, just a little bit of that stuff will make the whole place look black. I wonder if toner would make good charcoal substitute. But anyway, so we do that with our potting soil. Now, if you're not, for the people that are looking on the YouTube, if you're not in this area, you can buy our top pot or our acid mix potting soils from any nursery along the west coast of California, and I believe they can sell it in Arizona too, through if the nursery or garden supply center buys through L&L Nursery Supply, they can order it. And you can always call us up or email us and get the information that the buyer would need to buy it. So we can always do that if you're not in this area. We have about...
Change our soil now. I mean, if my soil has so much compost, how do I, because I'm forever buying new lavender, and buying new plants, and buying new vegetables, because they're just dying.
Right.
Do I just rip it all out? Really?
Yeah, I took mine down. Mine was in 8 inches deep, so I just dug into it, and when I see the color change back to normal, I just took that out and threw it away.
So the vegetables that I have growing now, can I kind of like keep them and just change the soil, or are they like?
You can change it slowly,
But
but I wouldn't try to fix it. Let's put it this way, it's too much work to fix it, or it takes too long to fix it, so you just take parts of it out at a time and just substitute. You can put in sand, you can put in our potting soils, either one will, either one will be more of a permanent thing than compost. Now, there are some farms, so University of California has had an article on the farms, and they said, the average farm is 99% mineral, well, 1.1% organic. They said there are some farms in the Delta region near Sacramento that are 40% organic because it's reclaimed marshland. They said those farms can only grow seasonal crops, so nothing permanent, and they have to manage their watering very carefully because, everything rots very easily in those types of soils. So they know it. Agriculture knows what's going on. I mean, in agriculture, the most expensive crops use the best soil. And usually those are hothouse crops, things that are grown in greenhouses. Well, in the hothouse trade, they use stuff like this, or perlite, or pumice. Peat moss is used. So is coconut coir and rice hulls, because they know how long they last. They know rice hulls can actually last 20 years. They just don't. Rice hulls are 20% silica. They just don't decompose. Peat moss, less than a year. Coconut coir, less than a year of a good crop if you're going to use this 100%. So, but they have a lot of crops that are less than a year, so they can use these things. But most of the ones that are the most expensive, they either use something like this, or the top of the line stuff uses this. This is interesting. It's clay beads. So it has the water retention, but it's got the air spaces because they fire them into beads. So the most expensive crops in the world use this, and that's marijuana, because this works the best. If you want a plant to absolutely grow the fastest you can, clay beads, clay pellets, pelletized clay. It's supposed to be the best one. Pumice is close. You just have to water more often.
Bricks.
Essentially, or it's fired clay. They fire clay into little round things so the air can get through there real well.
But I mean, they're round, but if they were odd shape and stuff, that's basically what those are, right?
Right. Yeah.
Huh.
But that's the top of the line stuff. But they said that they tried to use ground up wood and ground up bark. This was in Holland. They do a lot of research. The government does a lot of research for their growers because that's Holland's economy is what they grow in their hothouses. And they said they worked for years trying to use, Europe invented the pallet system of moving material. So they said they have a lot of wood, waste wood, that they wanted to try to use as a growing medium. They said, won't work at all. And they tried to use bark, won't work at all, because they said that ground up wood and ground up bark, you can't predict how long it'll last. One batch of wood might last a week before it decomposes to sludge. One section of a piece of wood may last years. They can't tell the farmer how long that wood will be a suitable growing medium, and they can't tell them how long bark will be a suitable medium. It's just too ununiform. Whereas in the U.S., that's what everybody's using. They use stuff that's unreliable. That, $2 million of research in Holland said it was unreliable, and here it's what they use. And we know that some nurseries have told us they got a bad batch of bark, wiped out their entire crop of camellias. They blamed the bark. But I don't know, in the old days they didn't use it. They didn't have any problems. So it is so strange that, and it's those professors that are pushing this that will not back down because it's their research. Because I've wrote letters to some of these guys saying, well, what they said is that the compost that they're using there, you generally have to hot compost it for 3 months before you can use it as a growing medium. You got 5 months of suitable use, and after 5 months, you have 3 options. You either make sure it's sold, you put in a bigger pot with fresh compost around it, or you throw it away, because at that point the compost becomes a toxic growing medium. And they don't think there's anything wrong with growing trees and shrubs in that. It's like, we see a lot of plants 2 or 3 years after planting die. I mean, I remember from one grower I got my plants, I had planted my yard back in the early 90s. From one grower, every single plant I got from, no matter what it was, died 3 years in the ground. And we pulled them out of the ground. The roots in our soil were fine, but everything was rotten right below the trunk of those plants. We know it was their soil mix that, after 3 years, killed the plant. And they don't get it. They don't know, that's the problem with nurseries now. See, we're a grower retailer. If we grow something, we're going to hear about it if something goes wrong. But the growers now are 2 or 3 layers away from the consumer. It used to be that nurseries sold directly to consumers. Now they don't. So the nursery never hears this. The guys at the universities never hear this. The guys at the very top of the industry don't hear this. They said, we didn't know it was a problem. Because I wrote to these guys, or emailed to them. We don't write anymore, we email. And he says, we've never heard this problem with the growing medium. They think everything's fine, because in most places in the United States, the nurseries get their stuff in the spring, it's gone before it gets cold in the fall. They never look at it again. It's gone out of their stores. They make sure everything's sold before fall. Here, we keep plants for years, and we see the things dying in the pots. Now, we know what to do. We just switch the soil out to a better dirt, and they're fine.
Jerry, can I ask a question?
Mm-hmm.
I hot compost live oak leaves,
Mm-hmm.
and they start out, they're quite acidic. You start out, but then after you fully compost them, they go neutral pH-wise.
Mm-hmm.
And I've been successful on citrus trees by putting on this much on the surface and then scratching it in and letting it go from there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, nature. Yeah, nature, the soil is essentially 100% mineral down here, but there's 5 inches of duff on top of it. That's the dead leaves.
Yeah.
They call that the duff layer. Again, I'm sure this is short for dead stuff, but they said the average across the United States, 5 inches of dead leaves. That's where all the minerals are, but it's not the plant's home. They live underneath. They live down here. This is where all the fungus, bacteria live. That's their home. And we're trying to make the plants live in this instead of this, which is a stupid thing. They're trying to make the fungus's home the plant's home, and it's not. They keep, they make it they leave out one step. The plants live in the mineral. They get their minerals, they get their nutrients from the duff layer, but it's not their home. It's someone else's home up there. So that's how we're supposed to set up. You leave it on top. Now farmers have to turn compost into the soil because they said if they don't, it just blows away. So, but if you don't have a bad winter in your yard, just leave it on top. That's where it should be. It decomposes best on top. Now the acidity, they say if things are decomposing without adequate oxygen, they create acids, which is okay for West Coast. We could use the acidity. If the oxygen level drops too low, you get sewer gases, which are toxic. So.
Does it turn into silt? Does the duff layer turn into silt?
No, it turns into carbon dioxide and water. So there's nothing left. I mean, if you put compost or any dead leaves on the ground and just see how fast they disappear, it's amazing. They disappear like half year, they're gone. They're totally gone. Yeah, avocado trees in nature. One of my friends went down to Guatemala. He said they dug through 5 foot of leaves before they got to the dirt. They're just piled up real deep underneath those trees. So anyway, that's how you want to set up your garden. Mulch, compost, organic matter on top, nothing below it. Make sure the roots have good airflow. Now, we're supposed to be talking about other things today. So water-wise, the main thing to know about watering is if the soil is right, it's very difficult to overwater anything. You'd have to do really, if it was a little pond there for a few months, you might have trouble with the lack of oxygen. So that's the main thing. But what is adequate water? For most plants, if they're in production mode, if you want them to grow, flower, make something, you've got to keep their entire root system moist. If they're half dry on the bottom, they shut down. They know they don't have enough water left. So if you have a plant in the ground and say this is the roots, the average rooting depth in a city, even with good soil, is less than a foot. So we want to make sure this top foot of soil is wet. How do you tell that? The little water meters they make have things about this long. They're not long enough. So in the old days, farmers walk around with rebar. Now I don't sell rebar. You can buy rebar at Ace Hardware. But if you take a metal rod like this, if the soil's moist, you can push something right through it. Just like a block of modeling clay. If that thing's wet, anything goes through it. If it's dry and too dry for plants, nothing will go through it. So the farmers would walk around their fields and see how deep they can push the rod into the ground. Now on farms, the soil is better. They expect 1.5 foot of roots, so they want about 1.5 foot of penetration when they stick the rod in the ground. So they'd get a 4-foot rebar, and if they can go in 1 foot, close to 1.5 feet, they were good. In your own yard, if you go down 1 foot, you're good. You've got adequate moisture in the ground. Generally at about 8 inches, things start shutting down. We've watched what lawns do when they're getting dry. So I remember back in 1998, we had like 35 inches of rain. I go back in my backyard and stick this whole stick all the way into the ground. And I had clay soil, and it would go all the way in. It was just crazy. Of course, all the plants looked wonderful with all that rain that year. But we noticed as our soil dried up, when you got down to about 8 inches of penetration, the grass tips blades start turning a little white. And at 6, they start turning pretty brown. And about 4 inches of moisture, the grass goes asleep. It just totally brown, looks like dirt there. Looks like it's gone, but it's just gone dormant on you. So at 4 inches of moisture, it can be 4 inches of mud, but if it's dry below that, the grass just goes asleep. Now, a lot of, quote, landscape plants, just shrubs that are green, you can let them go down to 4 inches. They're okay with that. Not for too long, but that's okay. It won't make them go to sleep. But for a production plant, things that are blooming, roses, vegetables, fruit trees, you got to keep it at 1 foot when they have foliage and they're actively growing. If they're dormant in the winter, no big deal. But if they're actively growing, you got to maintain it at 1 foot. I remember my orange tree once got down to 4 inches. We're going, oh my God. And every single orange in that tree split. We knew it was going to happen. We go, okay, this shouldn't have got that dry, but it did. And when those Santa Anas come up, sometimes you just aren't there to get the water on the ground. got down to 4 inches, and we knew every orange was going to split, and every single one did.
Well, I thought when they split, so they had too much water.
That's when they fill back up. So once they get dry, you're in big trouble, because if the water gets introduced too quickly, like if it rains on them, they're history. They just all split open. So the navel orange growers know that what they do, they said their strategy is to water 110% of what they're supposed to from August to November. Because if their crop dries up, they lose the whole thing. So,
Like you said, you can't overwater it. So.
right. Yeah, in the Central Valley 2 years ago, when they had a lot of rain that year, they're telling the farmers water twice as much as you need to. That's the fast way to re-get the water back to the water table, is just to water more. And the farmers were happy to do that. They get the salts out of their ground too, just by watering deeper. But they told them, just flood your fields, get that water back into the ground, because they don't have enough settling basins, settling ponds to do it. They had to have the help of the farmers to get that water back in there. So too much water generally is not a problem.
Some of the plants that you put down in the ground already, maybe they've been there a year or whatever, and little do you not know, that what or where compost that they use.
Right.
It's gotta go.
Right.
You just dig it up and get it knocked off and.
Yeah, what I've done.
Stuff and put it back down, and maybe it won't die in the next 2 or 3 years.
Yeah, what I've done is one time my wife planted some gardenias that were in the wrong dirt. So I went back in there. I knew they were going to die. We knew what company grew them, what would happen. So I just got back in there with a hand trowel a month or so later when I had time, and dug out half the root ball and replaced it with our dirt. And then a few months later, I dug out the other half of the root ball and replaced it with our dirt. And being gardenias, we still lost 1 out of the 3 I did, but 2 out of 3 made it, and we're still alive 20 years later. The 2 I never got around to doing both died. So, so you just do it that way. You can just go in and take it out. I mean, we did, one of the plants we never lost is citrus, and bougainvilleas we never lost either. So 2 years ago, I had one of my employees do a bougainvillea in the ground. And I told him, well, just shake all the dirt off and plant it. He goes, this is going to kill it. He's shocked. He never heard that before. But I told him, no, just go ahead. I told him to trim the plant maybe 50% of the foliage off, which would alleviate some of the shock. And then a week later, he says, look, the plant's dying. All the leaves are falling off. I said, don't worry about it. And what happens with bougainvillea is you shock them like that, the leaves fall off, but they're doing that on purpose to save themselves. And then 2 weeks after that, they refoliated, and they look gorgeous now. I mean, absolutely perfect bougainvilleas out there. They bloom year-round, no sign of any bad foliage at all. But we know if we plant them as is with the compost around the roots, they always stop blooming in the winter, and they get ugly in the wintertime when it's cool and moist, and they recover when it's hot and dry in the summer. But if you take the compost off there, they look good year-round. We've done citrus, knock all the soil off. Now, at the store when we're doing that, we're in a citrus quarantine zone now, so we don't sell citrus anymore. But last year when we were doing it, we would just shake all the soil off of them, put them in the shade for 2 weeks, then sell them. Then you could water as much as you want. My first job in the nursery industry, keep the citrus alive. Make sure I can water them when they were dry. But now, once we learned it was the dirt that was causing the trouble, just change the dirt. After that, you can water as much as you want. They love water. No more issues with the citrus either. Now, it is true, if you've got a root ball that's got a lot of compost on it, you can get away with it if you water with the drip and water right here and don't get that compost wet. Because back in the 80s, I did that with citrus, just put drippers on the edges, and so the center area stayed dry and they did fine. But if you want to water with sprinklers, you can't have that compost on them.
So the roots will just find their way away from that compost, right?
Yeah. Now, amount of water plants use. Generally, plants don't use water below 55 degrees. So we're getting to the point now, we're getting to the 50s now. usually about mid-November, from say mid-April to mid-November, we water our nursery every day. All the plants dry out in about a day, unless it rains real good. Even if it rains sprinkles, sometimes we have to water. But from mid-November to mid-April, it's like suddenly once a week is enough. Because if it drops down into the 40s or low 50s at night, half the day the plants aren't using any water. And suddenly we can go long periods without it. So late November through March, the amount of, like a lawn would need about 1 4-minute irrigation a week. But summertime, 10 times that. A lawn needs, they say, about 40 inches of water, 40 minutes of watering during a week in the summertime, and about 4 minutes of watering a week in the winter. Now, 4 minutes they use because that's about as long as your sprinklers should be on at one time. If they're on for more than 4 minutes, you start getting puddling and runoff, so you get uneven water absorption at that point, just because the ground can only absorb at max 1/4 inch of water per hour, and in 4 minutes you get more than that. So if you want to water 40 minutes of watering in a week, that's 10 different sprinkler cycles. That's like twice a day essentially. You say twice a day, 3 minutes each, we give you the right amount of water. Hour apart, so that you don't cause runoff. Runoff is totally wasted water. So, and the weird thing about it is that the demarcation between wet and dry spots on the lawn is so sharp, you just are convinced it can't be water. My first lawn back in the 80s watered at 40 minutes twice a week, and I had all these brown spots form. I thought couldn't be water. I'm watering so much, 40 minutes at a time, twice a week. It's got to be enough water. So I spray fungicide on there, insecticide on it, nothing worked. Finally, I started watering 3 times a day like I did when I seeded the lawn, and within 2 weeks it was back totally green. I'm going, okay, there's something wrong with the watering pattern that they're telling us to do. And that's when we learn, the longest the sprinkler should be on a lawn is 4 minutes. So I started watering 3 times a day, 3 days a week, and it was fine from then on. And actually, and truthfully, it's better to water daily. If it needs water daily, water daily. I mean, they did studies in an orchard in UC Davis. They watered 1/2 the orchard weekly, thoroughly, the other half the orchard daily, lightly. And they theorized that the deeply, infrequently watered side would have much deeper roots. Got exactly the opposite results. The lightly, frequently watered area had significantly bigger root system than the other side. So totally opposite what they thought was going to happen. Totally opposite what the DWP tells you happens, that plants develop a better root system with light, frequent irrigation. So
They did better by more frequent,
lighter.
lighter.
Well, Israel figured out 2 generations ago, you just drip it, drip, all day long, drip, 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 most efficient use of water. So there are some farms near Sacramento, they said they water 18 times a day. They turn on those drippers 18 times a day. They have computers, everything tells them how much water that plant used that last hour. They're using water, they said, every time it's above 80 degrees, and the Central Valley can be above 80 degrees for 18 hours a day, they're replacing the water that they used the last hour, and they said they save 30% on their water bill just by watering all day long. This much more efficient use of water. So.
This is a question on hardware. I've been using a drip system for veggies in the garden. Wouldn't I be smarter to use spray heads, like the 90-degree heads, and get a better coverage of the plants?
I like sprinklers better than drippers.
You do?
The farmers use a lot of drip though. They have the net of film and they just drip. But I like sprinklers better. Covers more of the soil.
So then you could run them more often for shorter time.
Yeah, the only disadvantage of watering at night is that some plants get diseased if their leaves stay wet for more than 4 hours. So like lawns, if their leaves are wet for 12 hours, they can get rust. Rose, if their leaves are wet for 4 hours, they can get rust. So make sure that when you water them, they'll dry off within that time. So like if I were sprinkler irrigating roses, I would water say 6 in the morning. So by 10 that morning, they'd be totally dry. Or if it was a lawn, don't water at midnight because it might take till the next noon for it to dry off. So
You like sprayers more than drippers for trees?
yeah, well they found out a long time ago that on a citrus you need at least 40% of the drip area to be covered with them to be moist.
Yeah,
So now instead of using drippers on them, they usually use soaker hoses going around them,
yeah.
or micro sprinklers shooting outwards from the trunk. They don't want to get the trunk on citrus
Yeah,
wet.
but they don't give as good a coverage as a sprayer.
Right.
So you're better off to have the spray heads close to the trunk of the tree and have them go out.
Yeah, a friend of mine in Hudson has the sprayers near the trunk shooting outwards.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
what I've been doing.
Yeah, that's good.
I didn't know you could leave the trunk wet.
Citrus, if the trunk and crown area where their trunk turns into roots is constantly moist, they can get gummosis, which is that infection on the trunk. In Florida, they plant their citrus this high because it rains so much there they can't help it. You go through an orchard in Florida, they look like they're on tiptoes. They have 8 inches of root exposed to get that crown up off the ground. Citrus is the only tree that the roots don't mind being in the sun. They don't burn. Okay, so irrigation, hopefully I covered enough. So if you use our potting soil or if you have plants in the right soil, overwatering is almost impossible. Close to it. Just do adequate watering. Fertilizer wise, I finally found out what farmers do. So this is kind of neat. So plants, animals, we are made out of 16 minerals. There's only 16 minerals that make up our body. Plants are made out of at least 17. Carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, sulfur, manganese, magnesium, calcium, iron, manganese, boron, zinc, copper, chlorine, nickel, and molybdenum. I'm pretty sure silicon's in there, but because soil is silicon, up until the time they started growing plants in pure organic matter, silicon was never an issue. It's funny, in my agricultural magazines, they suddenly are promoting the silicon product to spray on plants because they look a lot better, a lot sturdier when you spray silicon on them. Well, they used to grow plants in dirt. Dirt was pure silicon. Now that they grow plants in compost, you have to add the silicon to them. So we think silicon may be one of the minerals that plants need also, but that's just what dirt is silicon. But it is kind of funny. So anyway, carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, carbon dioxide, and water has all that. We don't think about those. The bulk of a plant is that. You look at a plant, plants are mostly cellulose, which makes up the cell walls of the plant. Cellulose is a sugar molecule that they rearrange so that we can't eat it. The only thing that can eat cellulose and turn it back into sugar is bacteria. So the animals who eat cellulose, like beavers and cows and things like that, have to have bacteria in their gut to turn it back into sugar. Termites have the same bacteria too. They have to have bacteria in there to consume the cellulose. Anyway, we don't think about that. Nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium are the big 3 nutrients that we usually have to add. Now the ratios on these are interesting. Say if you had 100 pounds of nitrogen is the main thing we add. If you had 100 pounds of nitrogen, what are the ratios of the other things you have to add to that? So it's 16 pounds of phosphorus, 62 pounds of potassium, 9 pounds of sulfur, 10 pounds of magnesium, 10 pounds of calcium, and everything beyond that is just microscopic. 0.7 iron, 0.4 manganese, 0.2 boron, 0.06 zinc. I remember once they cured the zinc deficiency in orchard by just hammering a galvanized nail in the trunk of each tree. Copper 0.05. Chlorine 0.03. Nickel is less than 0.01. Molybdenum is 0.003. Now, most of the metallic things, zinc, nickel, molybdenum, iron, manganese, magnesium, they're involved in the plant in the real complicated enzymes like chlorophyll. So chlorophyll that makes the leaf green has to have those minerals in it to make a part of that molecule. If not, they're not green. So when they're not green, you see a lot of, so you're missing, any of these things, the plant gets less green. Iron, manganese, magnesium, zinc, copper, they all affect the color of the plant. And they're involved in that photosynthesis. Nitrogen is the cell membrane of the plant. So all the membranes that are not the cell walls, but the membranes, we're all cell membranes. Our skin is all nitrogen, our hair is all nitrogen. Everything that encloses the cell is membranes. That's where the nitrogen is. So that's quite important for a plant. Other than the sugar, that's the most important thing. Phosphorus is the way plants transport and animals transport energy is a phosphorus molecule. If you took up organic chemistry, you know that ATP and ADP, adenosine triphosphate, adenosine diphosphate molecules are the energy transfer molecules. You need the phosphorus to transfer energy. They tell you need phosphorus for roots, for flowering. Well, yeah, you need to store energy. This is how you store it with phosphorus and distribute the energy too. Potassium is basically the fluid of your blood. So in our blood, potassium is the main salt of our blood. In plants, it is the main salt of their sap. So you need that. It doesn't have any particular purpose. If we're low in potassium, we start getting cramps, we're dehydrated, all that stuff happens because we need that to balance out our fluids. Sulfur, I'm not sure what that does. I think it's involved in some enzymes also. And again, most of these other things are enzyme things that are more of those complex molecules. So the bulk of the plant are these things. The ratio between these three is roughly 6. You can say that's about a 1. And that may be a 4, 2/3. 624, 6114, something like that. A growing plant, so in most crops in the United States, this is what they tell the farmers to do. So there are some products that we sell that are very much like that. Neem seed meal, of course, this is ground up seeds of a baby plant. I mean, this is meant to feed a baby plant. So the ratios have to be about right, 6:1:2. Very, very close to what we want. This product here, which says it prevents weeds, corn gluten, which is very dehydrating powder, happens to dehydrate sprouting seeds, so it's used to prevent weeds. But anyway, cornmeal, wheat middlings. I don't know what are wheat middlings? What is that? There's some potassium sulfate, which is mined from the ground, and some, I think, bone meal in here too. This one's 824, also quite similar to that. Now here's a chemical fertilizer that we use a lot here because we know it works fast. 15912. A little high in the middle one, but still not bad. 15912. This is a good product too. So now, unfortunately, there are companies out there that promote having balanced numbers. 20-20-20. Gardeners like 20-20-20, 15-15-15, 14, 14, 14. They think it's the right thing to use because all the numbers are the same. Well, not in a plant, they're not. And what we know now is that the high chemical phosphorus that's in here can kill off all the microorganisms in the soil, sterilize the soil, essentially kill the soil. And the other things to know is that nitrogen is the most leachable and volatile mineral in the ground. So it evaporates as ammonia, it leaches out as nitrates. So that's the one you need to add the most of. Phosphorus doesn't go anywhere. In fact, most of these don't go anywhere. You apply it once to the adequate amounts, and for the next generation, it's there. And that's the problem with this 20-20-20. You keep on adding this, your middle number keeps building up higher and higher and higher. The potassium's not bad. We're low here in potassium. Orange County has got about twice as much phosphorus as the plants need already. You build up that phosphorus level, you start killing the soil. So primarily nitrogen, potassium if you do it one time. This is a nice product here. It's mined from the dirt. It's called langobite. It's 0022. It's 22% potassium, but it's also 11% magnesium, which is another one we need a lot of. So it's a good ratio. They said in a plant root, potassium and magnesium are taken up through the same window in the root or whatever door through the root. And if you overload with one, you shut out the other. If you overload with this one, you shut out that one. So you got to put them on the right ratios. And the plants like these, the ratio of more potassium to magnesium. This has got twice as much potassium as magnesium in it. So it won't shut off the other one. So some people like to use Epsom salts, which is this magnesium sulfate. You put Epsom salts in a plant, it can't pick up the potassium. That's the problem with some of these anecdotal things that they do. The magnesium's important, but you put on straight magnesium, you go into potassium deficiency. You want them at the right ratio, which is in here. This is more potassium than magnesium. Well, a lot of stuff, you do that once. Again, you do that once. I asked, bananas need a lot of potassium. I asked my banana grower, Doug Richardson, he was up near La Conchita for a long, long time. He says they apply that once every 20 years. That's all they need. Of course, what they did is when the bananas were done, they would chop them up, the pieces up, and lay them back on the ground. So they weren't losing as much as a homeowner would say. Now, in the lexicon of fertilizers, there are things that are called simples. And the only thing that means is that this is just cottonseed meal. There's nothing else in it. So this is a simple fertilizer. It has all the ingredients in it because it's a seed. So it has to have everything that the plant needs. So it's got everything here. But it's a simple product. It's only got one thing. So we have a lot of different simples. Blood meal is this blood from cows. Langobite's is one mineral dug up from the ground. So those are your simple fertilizers. There's a lot of what are called blended ones, and all that is they just take the simples and mix them together. Fishbone meal, alfalfa meal, feather meal, potassium sulfate, sulfur, fish meal, kelp meal, rock phosphate, kelp flour. So the blended fertilizers, just that. Pardon? That's a good question. Well, plants always need fertilizer. If you go organic, if you use an organic fertilizer, they tend to break down slowly over a long period of time. So you just keep adding it. I don't know, the guys at the Soil and Plant Lab in Anaheim, they're the people who help the farmers out. They just tell them, when you need to fertilize. They tell me a homeowner would never know. We don't know what's in the ground. Even if you know what's in the ground, you don't know what the plant's picking up. You have to see the plant response. I mean, what they do is they take leaves off the orchard trees and analyze them and tell the farmer, oh, that's what you need now. They said it's really hard for a homeowner to ever determine what their plant needs. They just told me, stick with organic fertilizers, you're not going to be far off. So you take a dead plant, put it on the ground, yeah, everything the live plant needs is there. So they say you stay in the ballpark if you stay organic. If you go into chemicals, you can go way off. And if you use the wrong chemical, you go way, way off. So they said they're always, betting each other what the orchard's missing, and they said they're hardly ever right because it's hard to tell by looks what the plant needs. Although, some things are pretty easy to tell. Lack of nitrogen makes the center vein turn light colored. Iron is the one that everybody gets messed up on, though, because everybody keeps thinking it's an iron problem, and it's rarely ever a problem because if a leaf has iron in it, it can't lose it. So if your leaves are turning yellow, it's never an iron issue because if you didn't have any iron, they would never be green. And usually if they turn yellow, it means you've lost your root system. Your roots are dying, so your plant's not picking up the fertilizer. I mean, they use that as an excuse a lot. So when they're trying to grow plants in compost, they would say, well, the plants, you have to augment the compost with more nitrogen because the compost is still in the nitrogen, so the plant's turning yellow. No, it's not turning yellow from that. It's because the roots are dying in your compost. And they keep saying, oh, you got to augment it with more nitrogen. Even though this thing's full of nitrogen, you got to augment it because it's composting. They had to make a lot of excuses for us to work with compost and we were working with compost for 20 years before we figured out, oh, it's the worst thing in the world. And we had to make all these rules about watering and fertilizing, all this to compensate for the compost. Well, once you get rid of that stuff, it's a lot easier. Now, we're not totally against chemical fertilizers because they work right away. So if you have an immediate need, now organics are better in the long run, and they're safer to use in the long run too. But there's some neat products out there, like this was developed by Dr. Tommy Cairns, who was a chemist by trade. He loved roses, worked over at the Rose Hills in Whittier, developed the exact fertilizer they would need for their soil and water. So in this area, you can say, well, this is probably the best rose food out there, or the fastest working, because he developed this for Rose Hills. So with their type and their soil, I'm sure, and their water is not much different than ours. This is going to be right on for roses. University of Florida developed this for palm trees. So it's kind of universal now what we do for palm trees. It's not that different than what we do for other plants. It's 15-5-15. But you can use this on any plant, they'll love it. Whatever palm trees need, most plants would like it too. Now, calcium we need in a lot amount, and the way to get calcium in the ground is just gypsum. So gypsum can't change your soil from clay to dirt. It doesn't do that stuff. It makes the soil absorb water faster for quite a while, which is good, which makes the soil seem less slimy anyway. But it is a source of calcium, and we are always needing some calcium in the plants too. So most of especially the orchards, they said they had a lot of calcium every year, a lot of gypsum every year to their trees. Helps prevent root rot on avocados. And calcium is also needed to finish off a lot of the fruiting vegetables and the tree crops too. If you don't have enough calcium in a tomato, you get that black spot at the bottom. If you don't have enough in peppers, you get hard spots in the peppers. Squash, cucumbers can also develop end deformation on the fruits if there's not enough calcium. Apples get bitter pit, little hard spots in the flesh if they don't have enough calcium. So there's a lot of fruits that suffer from lack of calcium. Apparently there's not enough calcium in our tap water, and the other minerals kind of mess it up. So they said to add calcium constantly. Our avocado grower says they had 40 pounds to each tree every year. I'm going, I can't believe that. That's a lot of calcium on a tree every year. But that's, their website said that. I'm going, I read it over and over and over again. I can't. Yeah, that's a lot.
Every year?
Yeah. So, I don't know. Now, there are some specialty foods out there. We've got the Fox Farm products. And these are for the guys who really want the exact best crop. I mean, this is meant for growing pot. So if you want the best darn pot plants you can, they've done a lot of research in that. They know what to do. If you want to grow the biggest tomatoes in the world, you can use something like that. But for most of us, it's not that critical to spend that much money on one thing. Now, one thing we found about plants back in the 80s is that they make sugar, but they'll also absorb it. And it makes them grow faster. So it turns out that when they do those contests like grow the biggest pumpkin in the world, those guys know what they're doing. They have a solution of seaweed, which is a super powerful growth hormone, makes things grow faster and bigger. Fish emulsion, which gives them a lot of the rare fertilizers in liquid form, and sugar. And they said if they don't use this combination, they can't break 500 pounds. So they got pumpkins now at 2,000 pounds. Well, they're constantly foliar feeding their plants. And we know sugar works. We found that out in the 80s that can make things speed. It's just like cheating. It's like having an extra 4 or 5 hours of sunlight on that plant every day if you spray sugar on the foliage. We're amazed that the leaves absorb sugar, but I guess it makes sense. Originally it was molasses. Now we just use table sugar or caro syrup because molasses is so brown it makes everything turn brown. But we've been doing this in our nursery since the 80s because we know it works.
It's put in the soil or sprayed on the leaf?
On the leaves.
On the leaf.
Yeah.
Certain trees are out.
Any plant you want to do it on, except for maybe a cactus may not have open pores. That's why they're cactus. So it may not work on cactus, but any other plant, the leaves will absorb the sugar and grow a lot faster. We did our acid test once on a plum tree. So I had a plum tree that was making about 5 plums per branch. It was a big plum tree. So I was getting hundreds of plums every year. So I wanted to test it on the plum tree to see if I can increase the production in one branch. So in the fall, on most fruit trees, it's the fall when they actually store the energy from the sun. Spring and summer, they're just growing. You spray sugar on them, they grow faster. In the fall, they store it. So one branch of the tree, the instructions were every 2 weeks you spray the branch with the sugar formulation. So I sprayed the one branch every 2 weeks during the fall, and the next year that one branch, instead of having 5 plums on it, 28 plums on one branch. You're going, oh, that worked. And this branch was on the north side. It wasn't on the side that was getting that much sun, but it produced my best crop right there. So we said, okay, that thing works. So we started spraying our whole nursery with sugar all year, all summer, and well, mainly during the growing season to make the plants grow faster. And we see a difference. Bigger leaves. Well, you can make up your own, but essentially from these products, it's 1 ounce, 1 ounce, and 1 ounce of this per gallon of water. So you can take it down, and there's no rules on this. It's not going to hurt if you make it weaker or stronger. So you can use table sugar, you can use caro syrup. If you have if you don't want to mess up your sprayer, use caro syrup. It's already dissolved, won't clog up your sprayer. But again, the seaweed makes things grow really fast and huge. I was spraying on citrus. You get leaves this big. It's just comical what the plants look like. Some of our fig trees had leaves like this. We're going, okay, that's funny looking, but it's fun what you can do with this stuff.
You had sugar, fish emulsion,
And seaweed.
and seaweed.
I mean, you can use other types of fertilizer than the fish, but the fish does flow well. I mean, this combination, you smell like a harbor after you're done. So.
And again, you would do that early morning, wouldn't you, so it has time to dry out?
The longer it stays moist, the more it gets in. We usually do it in the evening. Right.
Is that a side benefit? Your backyard smells like a harbor?
Yeah, we don't do it too much in the nursery right now. We do the sugar and we just use the regular water soluble fertilizer because I notice when we use fish, all the windows start slamming behind us. So we don't do the fish here anymore. Seaweed's not too bad.
I've been using on my tomatoes, I plant them in something which is like pure top pot. 100%. I throw in a cup of this much top pot, and I put in a cup of calcium and a cup of 999, and
Well, it's better to go.
You like that ratio for NPK.
Yeah, I mean, if you wanted to use chemical fertilizers because they work faster, then Osmocote certainly has 11 minerals in it. So instead of just the 3 things, the 999, you can get, this has got magnesium, sulfur, boron, copper, iron, manganese, molybdenum, and zinc. And then you can use your gypsum in there too, and that'd give you the calcium. And gypsum's calcium sulfate, so you get the sulfur in there too. Well, this does have sulfur in it also.
And I have been throwing in a handful or a cup of micronutrients. So that would be the equivalent of that.
No. I mean, I'm not 100% organic positive. Like I used to be totally into organics in the 90s, and I thought, well, this is kind of narrow-minded. So, when we start plants, we always use this because it works right now, whereas the organics, well, most organic fertilizers take 2 or 3 or even 4 weeks to start working because they're not, plants can't eat that. It has to be broken down by bacteria first, and then the bacteria has to die before the plants can get it. So it takes a while. Now a lot of organic fertilizers are going this route. So Dr. Earth has this new one called Life. And we noticed that when we were next to an organic farm for 4 years, when they applied fertilizer, it smelled really like a sewer, open sewer. Because to make the fertilizers work better, you got to ferment them first. Get the bacteria in there already. So a lot of the organic fertilizers are starting to do that because they know that with the original stuff, which this is a blend of organic fertilizers, this may take a month to work. This stuff works within a week or 2 because it's already broken down. So you open this up, it does smell somewhat like a sewer or a dead rat because it's already been broken down by bacteria, and then the bacteria the dead bacteria in here can feed your plants faster, whereas this stuff may take 2 or 3 times longer to work than this one. This one works the same day. That's the advantage of the chemicals. They work right now. It's just that if the ratios aren't right, well, plus this doesn't feed your dirt, whereas these things feed the organisms that keep your soil fluffy and alive too, so they have that benefit also, is keeping the ground better. So you don't want to go purely chemical, but once or twice doesn't hurt. Just make sure you got a good mulch layer on top of the ground. I mean, in nature, that's where all the minerals are from, is from the dead leaves.
So that Dr. Earth Life would be good to when you're putting it in the ground, put some of that in.
Right. Now, okay, so there's one organism that's real important to plants. It's called a mycorrhizal fungus. This was not known to exist 50 years ago. They found out in the last 50 years that mycorrhizal fungus is the symbiotic partner of 95% of all plant species known. If they don't have this, they're probably not going to make it. So most of the organic fertilizers, like Dr. Earth, have a bunch of mycorrhizal fungi in here, spores. Now, a mycorrhizal fungi you would know the name of is truffles. That's the mycorrhizal fungus partner of oak trees in France and Spain that helps them recycle dead oak leaves. So the fungus is up there in the duff layer of the soil, eating all the dead leaves. The mycorrhizal fungus is attached, it's up here, but it's also attached to the plant roots. And they found out that 80% of the roots on trees are actually the fungus and not the root hairs of the plant. They didn't know that 50 years ago. They thought all these little root hairs were the part of the tree. No, it was the mycorrhizal fungus that's attached to the roots of the tree that's recycling all the leaves on the surface. So now Concern Report said this is all snake oil. I would tell you not quite. In the ground, you don't have to add this. It's all over. But if you planted something in a pot with our potting soil, there's no mycorrhizals in there. And if you put a cutting or a seedling in there, there's no mycorrhizal. So it'd benefit to have this in the soil with your plant if it started that way. If it started from a bare root, they've already got the mycorrhizal. They've already been in the ground. They've already got their mycorrhizals on them. But in a pot, a seed plant, or now grasses, most grasses can get by without it. They're one plant in nature that doesn't need it, but they're happy to have it too. Most of them are happy to have it. The brassica family, the cabbage family, doesn't use mycorrhizal fungus. In fact, they hate it. So if you have a cabbage, broccoli, cauliflower, in nature, those are one of the pioneer plants. Mustard in the same family? Anyway, they're some of the plants that come in when new soil forms, like the edge of a riverbed, landslide, after a fire. No mycorrhizals around. The grasses and a lot of the brassica family come in. They're the ones that mine the soil, get all the nutrients into dead leaves. Once they have enough dead leaves on the ground, the mycorrhizals and the other plants come in and take over. So you go into an old forest, you don't see any grasses or weeds around. It's all trees and dead leaves, because they've kind of closed the system up where it's just mycorrhizal fungi taking all the nutrients out of that, putting them right back into the tree. The weeds don't have a chance.
So if you make compost, you're making mycorrhizal.
Well, my compost is bacterial degradation of plants. So once we heard that they work better without the bacteria around, we just started chopping things up and then throwing them back on the ground, because the bacteria and the mycorrhizal fungus aren't happy with each other. They're almost opposites. So if you don't put something in a compost pile first, just throw it on the ground, in theory it works faster. So we stopped doing composting in trash cans when I learned that, and I would tell you the stuff disappears as fast or faster than it did when we composted it first. The only thing compost can do that just throwing stuff on the ground doesn't is makes things look better, smell better, well, look better. And you can get rid of some diseases by the heat that composting makes, and some of the weed seeds too.
So
But
you could just chop up those leaves. You could,
you don't have to chop them up, just throw the leaves on the ground. Everything else chop up. Yeah, the branches and stems chop up so it looks better. So you just put them on the ground.
Like all your green waste, you could do that?
Yeah.
Do that?
Yeah, they said they tested the speed. They said the mycorrhizal fungus can recycle carbon or nutrients from the dead leaves in as quickly as 90 days after it falls off the tree. That's fast. So.
Got a question.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry. Going back to the sugar fish oil or fish emulsion, that thing, and that's sprayed on the plant itself, not in the soil, utilized in the soil. Why?
It'll work in the soil too, but it works better in the plant.
So it just goes straight into the plant. You
Right.
can do it that way.
Yeah, it's funny. They found out if you spray sugar on the ground makes nitrogen. It's because that's what nitrifying bacteria need to make nitrogen. They need a sugar source. So most nitrifying bacteria are attached to legumes and other things. They get sugar from the roots, and then they make nitrogen. Well, if you spray sugar on the ground, you do the same thing. It turns into nitrogen. So it's kind of neat that way too. They found that out. Okay, so that's fertilizing. So we're always guessing on how much fertilizer to use. If you overdo organics, you don't cause trouble. If you overdo some of these chemicals, you certainly can. So it's better to go organic. But telling you how much to put down is always a guessing game. It's good fertilizer. I don't think it's worth the price that they sell it for. Most people buy it because anecdotally it controls insects in plants. Have not seen the scientific research that says that, but a lot of people swear by it. The company who makes it swears by it. They can't put it on the bag because the EPA won't let them for some particular reason. I can't remember what it was. The fact that it's not a controlled manufacturer or something like that. Right. So it's worm poop. They claim it kills whiteflies in plants that are sitting in the worm poop. I can't say that it could work that way, but that's what, people will buy it for that. It may work.
Do you use that here?
No. The one reason to use sulfate ammonia is it is highly acidic, and some plants, especially blueberries, seem to get a very good response if you use this once in a while, every few years or so. throw this on the ground, makes the ground really acidic. And azaleas, blueberries, certain plants that need a highly acid environment kind of like this.
Is citrus like acidic?
They don't need it.
They don't need it.
Would blackberries like it?
It wouldn't hurt them. Most blackberries live in acidic soil, so. But blueberries, definitely, if you don't have the acidity. I mean, feeding my blueberries organic fertilizers after 10 years, they were getting kind of pale, so we just tossed a little of that on there and just, boom, deep green. So we know they had to go more. We were getting kind of alkaline on them. Now, the University of California went around the Central Valley surveying. They wanted to see how the soil, different types of soil affected the plant life there. They said their observations showed no effect. If it was clay, sand, silt, if it was high in nutrients, they said the plants they were surveying did not take any nutrients from the soil. They said they all were existing on piled up dead leaves. So apparently the soil doesn't have to be the source of any nutrients. And that's what blows me away when all the college professors and the growers say, oh, you can't use that, it has no nutrients. It's like, no, that's not what the soil's about. Soil, right, soil is just there to store water, breathe, keep the plant upright, keep the roots insulated. So we'll talk about that next. So what they know is that the roots don't like to be below 35 degrees or above 86. And if the soil's got 3 inches of compost or mulch on top of it, it usually stays below 90 degrees. If it doesn't, in a summer day, you know, in a typical 90-degree summer day, the top foot of the soil will be about 120 degrees. And that's pretty much lethal to plant roots. So your plants, if your plants are sitting, like we see roses in a bed, clean bed, they look like they're suffering all summer. They just look burnt up. You mulch that bed deeply, those plants look like springtime all year. It makes a huge difference on a lot of plants to have that mulch on top because it insulates the soil.
Got the avocado trees and stuff, you said you had that layer, like how far away from the trunk and then how far out? I guess you can go out as far as you want, but
Right.
like what's a good, if it's a, I don't know, 20-foot tree or something?
Well, the roots will be where the water's applied. So if you only water near the tree, that's where you have to do it. But, you know, they can go, like they say, a typical tree in a forest, the root system's about 3 to 20 times wider than the tree is tall. I mean,
20 times?
right. I mean, I had a 30-foot maple in my front yard. It was a silver maple. My first house I bought, the roots kept getting to the sewer, so I pulled the tree out, and then I pulled the roots out. I couldn't believe how long the roots were. A 20-year-old tree. It ran 40 foot to the large front yard, 40 foot to my front slab of my house, and it followed the slab. Didn't go under slab. Followed the slab all the way to my back door. It's like over 100 foot of root. In 20 years, that tree had over 100 foot of roots on it. Yeah. They can, but generally where the water is. I mean, the slab of a house, it's wet underneath there because they make sure the soil is saturated before they build the house, so it won't rise anymore after they build it. So it's saturated. So they love that water source. All my plants, the roots went to the slab and stopped with the. And they went underneath the slab maybe this far and stopped because they can't breathe underneath there. But they all went to the slab, and that was their water source. But that tree followed, what it did is it followed the sprinkler lines because the homeowner had put his sprinklers in this deep. You know, your sprinkler is supposed to be 18 inches down because the roots don't go down that far. But anyway, they followed all the sprinkler lines to the front slab of my house and all the way around to the back door. So, but generally, wherever you water, because I had one citrus in my backyard, I had 3 drippers on it. And that's the only place I found any roots at all. There was a ball of roots around each dripper, and that's it. I couldn't find any roots anywhere else. The other thing about mulch is what they're finding. Not only a source of nutrition and a source of insulation, it also stops the weeds because it's too dark for the weed seeds to start underneath it, and it's too dry. The mulch usually stays drier, so they can't start in it. So generally, the mulch is imperative if you want to stop weeds in your yard. The other thing about mulch is what they found is that if the air is fairly humid, it creates water. So some farms up in the northern coast, they said, in the summertime, their apple orchards, they have to water all summer long, but they looked next to them in the forest and everything was lush and green, and they didn't understand until they walked in there. They said, in the mornings in the forest, everything's dripping. The foliage is dripping, the ground's soggy wet, because it's cooler and the water just condenses in there at night. So they said once they covered their orchard with 18 inches of mulch, they said they called up the local tree trimmers, brought over the tree trimmings, and just piled them in the orchard 18 inches deep. They said they haven't watered since the 80s. They said it just creates its own water. So in humid climates, because this is Pacific Coast, it works. So even Texas, they found the same thing. They said they're having a drought in Texas. Now Texas is usually 80% humidity at least in the summertime, a lot worse than here. So they said that they had a drought. All the plants along the sides of the highways were dying, so they had the chipper crews coming and chipping them up and depositing all the chips on one side of the highway. They said that side of the highway greened up. They couldn't figure it out. They never figured it out. They didn't know what was happening. But all that mulch layer was creating the condensation, and they're creating water. So you put a really deep layer of mulch down. Now for their row crops, they're only going a foot deep. For their tree crops, they're going a foot and a half. And for the row crops, yeah, when they wanted to plant new crops, they would have to pull the mulch aside, plant the plants in the dirt, and then leave it open for a little bit until they got enough height, and then they put the mulch back. They said they haven't had to fertilize much. Of course, they said they do. They admit they raise chickens, so the chicken poop probably does all that. Chicken poop is actually really good stuff. I mean, in my yard, if we have a new bed that we're preparing, we'll put down. Favorite thing to do is put down a layer of chicken manure, real thin layer, maybe 1/4 inch thick, then pile the regular mulch on top of it for looks. And that's a nice combination, nutrition and insulation and weed stopping, all that.
The what mulch?
Just any other, like we sell different